Well, as you saw on the news, the Prime Minister has increased his government's commitment on the maternal health issue. It'll total another $3.5 billion to 2020. While there has been controversy on that issue, there have also been a lot of compliments about Stephen Harper's initiative, where internationally it's been proclaimed a success. But as has so often happened in the last year, good news often gets crowded by difficult news. And in the last few weeks, that has come from some of the Prime Minister's own former senior staffers in the books they have written. Everyone is here at the table tonight, so let's get started. And we're talking about two books, one by Tom Flanagan, one by Bruce Carson. Neither of these gentlemen have been on the Prime Minister's Christmas card list for a number of years for different reasons, but it's their books. First of all, before we talk about what's in them, the general sense of tell-all books by former senior staffers, is this a good thing or not?
I think on balance they serve the public interest. You have to read them with a somewhat jaundiced eye. Like any first-person account, they're going to be self-serving. Oftentimes there's maybe scores to be settled, and you have to kind of have a certain skepticism about it, but oftentimes we learn things about the inner workings of government that we wouldn't have known otherwise, and I think on balance that's a good thing.
Chantal?
I think they are too rare in the Canadian culture. We do not get inside, and I'm not really looking for them for character flaws of whoever they worked for, but for how people arrived at decisions. Things we assume, things we presume because we aren't there, and so they help people understand what happened. I think Stephen Harper, ironically, is kind of beating a record amongst prime ministers for having tell-all books being written about him, and the reason they take up so much space is that he's been so secretive, so looking out to not be known, that anyone who has had an inside glimpse has actually become more interesting for the Prime Minister's reluctance to be out there and put himself out there to Canadians.
Yeah, I got to say, from recent Prime Ministers, there haven't been a lot of sort of insider tell-alls.
I spent months interviewing people who had worked for premiers, prime ministers at the time of the referendum, and I was struck by how all these people still spoke well of their former bosses. None of them had written books.
Also, there's more of them out there. He's gone through 4 chiefs of staff and, 8 communications directors.
Right. Yeah,
some of them are going to write a book.
A lot of potential authors. Bruce?
Well, I think we call these books tell-all books, but in reality, more of them are tell-some books. They don't really get into the everyday, grinding, harsh, and sometimes unpleasant-looking reality of what goes on. And I think that's largely a good thing if we're talking about staffers. I agree with the general proposition that we could stand to have more insider accounts of the substance and the process and the thought behind what's going on. And to some degree, that can and should be done by staffers. But as somebody who worked in politics at different times in my life, I do feel that there's a certain line that staffers should try not to cross, which is to reveal the inner workings of the political consensus as it's being developed, or in ways that really kind of affect their own outcomes and make them look better at the expense of the people that they were working for.
We should say also, when we're talking about tell-all books, we're talking about staffers' books. Once upon a time, you might have been talking about a cabinet minister's books.
Yes.
How many of the present or former cabinet ministers in this government will anybody be interested in hearing their accounts of? I'm not sure you can even get to one hand.
We'd be well served to have more of those kinds of accounts. There are a number of really good books about politics that have been written in the last year or so. Susan Delacourt's, Paul Wells, and others. So.
But those insiders, not inside the system,
I think you're right. We could use more insider accounts, but maybe not the staffer version.
But I sometimes wondered, is a leader not due some privacy on some of the big decisions that are made from people who he has surrounded himself with? Because, look, people are human. Things can get, pretty tense in those kind of situations. Lots of things are said that aren't expected to be revealed at a later date.
Well, it's a trade-off, though. I mean, they've tried to put in place a gag order, I guess is the phrase, on staff on Parliament Hill. But if you do too much of that, you're not going to get people to want to take the job. So I think it's, you sort of pay your money and take your choices. If you want to get good people, chances are they're going to at some point maybe go and tell people afterwards what they know. All right, let's have a look at some of the things that have been said then. First of all, by Tom Flanagan, who was a former chief of staff for Stephen Harper, but it's been almost a decade since he was there. This is one of the things he says in his book, Persona Non Grata.
He had enormous gifts. He's talking about Stephen Harper. He had enormous gifts of intelligence, willpower, and work ethic, but there is also a dark, almost Nixonian side to the man. He believes in playing politics right up to the edge of the rules, which inevitably means some team members will step across ethical or legal lines in their desire to win for the boss. Now, here's Bruce Carson in his new book, 14 Days, and we should say that there are a lot of flattering things about Stephen Harper in this book. This one is not necessarily unflattering, but it is revealing. Here's what he says. One curious feature of decision-making in the Harper government is that, unlike most other political leaders, the PM does not have an informal group of trusted, independent advisors across the country that he consults on a regular basis to see how he or the party are doing on various aspects of its agenda. One could argue that this leaves Harper isolated and dependent on a very small group in his employ for advice. What do we make of those, Bruce?
Well, you know, I think these are cases in point where former staffers are writing about a government that's still in office. And for me, that crosses a line that I think probably shouldn't be crossed. It's not to say that they couldn't write a book after the government is in office, or that people who were in cabinet and left government couldn't do that. But there's something about this that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, just as kind of a morality question. And I don't believe gag orders are the way to solve it. I think that's worse than having some of these stories come out. But I think the larger point for Mr. Harper is that he's been so effective at not having people tell positive stories about him. These are the only stories that most people hear. And even though Mr. Carson and Mr. Flanagan are trying to be somewhat flattering in some of the characterizations, wouldn't it be better for Mr. Harper and his supporters if people also heard stories told by third parties in book form about some of the better things that people might think Mr. Harper's done?
I'm more struck by the fact that Stephen Harper has staffers do that to him. When Brian Mulroney ran through his fair share of chief of staffs and staffers, and Jean Chrétien did not have that happen to them. And I think it speaks to not only the revolving door of the PMO, but the fact that Stephen Harper may have many qualities, but he does not, as far as I can see, inspire in people who work close to him, or even people in his cabinet and caucus, the kind of loyalty that some ministers felt towards Jean Chrétien and his staffers. Obviously, you couldn't imagine Jean Pelletier, the chief of staff that was the longest with Jean Chrétien, the Tom Flanagan, in the sense that he went with him to power, ever going even to give you an interview to talk about things like that.
But, you know, beyond the ethics of whether or not they should say it, what about what they said? Is this telling us something about Stephen Harper that perhaps we didn't know? I
think so. I just want to say very quickly, though, to Bruce's point, at least these people are putting their names to it and are taking accountability for it. The journalist's account, it's going to be unnamed sources in the dark. But I'm struck by the consistency between the different accounts, these two in particular. A lot of it is stuff that we know, the secretiveness, the paranoia, the controlling tendencies, the diminishing group around him, all those things are all known. We get a bit more of an inside glimpse when it comes to things like the temper tantrums, the alleged bouts of depression. Again, some of that we think we know, but has a bit more freshness and concreteness to it. And when you put it all together, I guess my point is, any one of those things you might say, okay, well, that's fine. But if you put it all together, the lack of good outside advice, the tendency to react angrily against things, the lack of sort of checks and balances internally, frankly, I think you get things like this very ill-judged sortie against the Supreme Court justice. I mean, it's inexplicable otherwise, and certainly it comes out from people around him who've been around him who say, again, possibly self-servingly, if I'd been there, we never would have done this. But certainly they're very unhappy and uncomfortable with it. Bruce?
Well, I agree that these are stories that tend to confirm the things that we already know, and I think that the publishers know that these are the things that will sell copies, and the authors are informed by the publishers that these are the things that will sell copies. But I can't help but think, we were looking at a story earlier today of the Prime Minister talking about his maternal health initiative. It does get high praise from people in different parts of the world, and probably is very poorly known by many Canadians. It's just not a subject that attracts a great deal of in-depth reporting. Wouldn't it be better for the Prime Minister to have people tell stories about their observation of his personal commitment to that, he's obviously quite emotional about the subject in terms of his comments today, but those stories don't get out. And I'm struck by the fact that I think that's more because the Prime Minister is a very private person and sees that storytelling as risk, not potential reward or benefit or balance or anything like that.
Want to add to that before we move on?
Well, it's still, I agree with Andrew that it does drive you to the kind of stories we've watched. I think part of it is accidental. The Prime Minister gets to office and grows one way or the other, and circumstances do shape that. I will continue to believe that losing Nigel Wright and ending up with people who are very faithful to Stephen Harper but have very little outside world experience has meant that he's now surrounded by enablers rather than challengers. And I think prime ministers need challengers.
Up to a point, I think he's well advised not to be too available. And yes. I think he's learned the lesson of Chrétien versus Mulroney, for example, that if you're too available, you start to lose some of the. Yes, exactly. Right? He's possibly taken things too far in the other direction.
Okay, I want to quickly touch. You raised the Supreme Court issue because Carson, who we should mention, is up for a charge on influence peddling. I think he's in court actually next week. But in terms of the Supreme Court, Carson was asked, what did you think of this, the fight with the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin? Here's his quick answer on that.
I just think it was just, I don't know if bad judgment's the right word, but my goodness, it certainly is it's certainly not a fight a prime minister should be picking.
Where are we on this fight?
Well, right now we're at the Prime Minister is trying to make an issue of Justin Trudeau's judgment, and Bruce Carson's trying to make an issue of the Prime Minister's judgment. It's all a bit strange. We're in a very, very uncomfortable place because not only have we had this fiasco in the past now that we've all been thoroughly hashing over to do with the appointment of Nadon and then the scrambling to, when it was rejected, et cetera. But now we're faced with a situation where it's very unclear what the process is going to be going forward. If you're a Supreme Court justice, are you going to lend any of your advice to this? No, you're not, because it's going to get used against you. If you're an opposition member, are you going to take part in the process, the sort of nascent process that they develop for consultation? Well, it's been shown to be a sham. They've got them freelancing now to get the Quebec government to sort of bail them out of this present situation by providing lists. Are we sure we want to go down that road of setting precedents there? I mean, the Prime Minister and his people are saying this isn't a precedent. The government of Quebec naturally is saying it is. And we're kind of stumbling into that process without, I think, anybody really having thought through the implications.
All right, we've only got a minute left.
I think there were always and there should be consultations between the province's Attorney General and the Supreme Court justices. So I don't see this as a constitutional win, but and it will solve the immediate issue of filling the post that's left vacant by the Nadon mess. There's another vacancy to be filled in November. We are out of a process. And frankly, once you've seen a government manipulate the process at the federal level, is it really a solution to think that you're going to hand it to another government that will not do that? I think the faith in governments handling this amongst themselves has been shattered by this episode.
You got the last word, Bruce.
Well, I think the government's lost the stomach for this fight. I think that there was a moment in time where they thought this would be challenging the Supreme Court Chief Justice would be red meat to the base. I think the base decided it was more like tofu. They weren't really interested in it. And even the people who thought there was some merit in the Prime Minister's argument about the technicalities of the relationship with the Chief Justice, and there weren't that many of those, didn't like the feel of the fight, thought it was beneath the role of the Prime Minister, and he squandered some political capital as a result.
All right. Got to leave it at that for tonight. We won't be on next week, by the way. I'll be in France. A week from tonight is the eve of the D-Day anniversary, 70th this year, and I know you'd all want to come to France to do the program from there, but budgets the way they are, unfortunately, won't be able to allow that. But thank you all for tonight. I'll see everybody in a couple of weeks' time.